Welcome to Intuit Tech Stories. The Intuit Tech Stories webinar series is an online event series that invites attendees to experience Intuit's cutting-edge technologies and show how they are used to power prosperity around the world. Before I pass it on to Shagun really quick, I want to give you some quick notes on open source culture at Intuit. That's something that I help drive a lot of. You may have seen us active with Hacktoberfest, for example, which is a month-long open source celebration in the month of October. But without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Shagun, our woman of the hour. Shagun is one of our most active open source community members here at Intuit, and she was our Grace Hopper Celebration 2022 open source co-chair. You'll get to hear a bit of Shagun's experience. She has a lot to share, so I hope you find this a very rewarding webinar. All right, Shagun, it's all you.
Thank you so much. And that was a kinder introduction for me than I would have given myself. So I really appreciate it. So excited to present to you today. I think there's going to be a lot of value that you're going to get through this presentation. Like Lucy mentioned, I'm a software engineer at Intuit, and I've been involved with the open source program pretty much from the day I joined the company, because that is just how much it is entrenched into our culture. But most recently, I also had the amazing honor of being the co-chair for the open source track. And as part of that, I had the opportunity to meet so many people within the open source community, because we also organized one of the largest hackathons for women in open source to get more women to join the community. So anyhow, for today, I want you guys to walk away with a few things. First of all, knowing what open source is, and more importantly, how it can help your career. I see so many of you are interested in making contributions, and I'd love for you to kind of understand and see just how far those contributions can take you and how they can help you in your career. But also how to contribute effectively and what type of contributions to make, and sort of how to find those projects and issues in the first place. And of course, I want to address the elephant in the room, the imposter syndrome that we all deal with, and talk about how we can overcome that fear of contribution, of entering that open source world in the first place. Additionally, I will be sharing with you some responses that I got from a survey that I had done to collect open source stories and anecdotes and advice from members of the open source community. So you won't actually just hear from me, you will also hear from a few other people who are active within the open source community and what they think about some of these things. So without further ado, the first thing I want to talk to you guys about before we even get into the definitions and things is how open source can help your career. I feel like there are so many different benefits of being a part of the open source community. I talked about earlier how I got to meet a lot of people, but that is not the only value that you derive from this community. One of the biggest things that I think a lot of people talk about when they discuss how open source has helped them, it's to do with upskilling. Specifically, it's to do with improving not just your software engineering skills or your code contribution skills, but a bunch of your soft skills as well. It helps you be a better communicator, a better code reviewer, and in general improves the tech culture of any place that you're working at or participating in. The other thing, similar to me, is of course networking and getting to meet other people. For example, Luciana, she and I actually met at Open Source Day because she, as the maintainer for the Python extension of VS Code, was one of the members and audience members of the Open Source Day hackathon. But it's not just about meeting people. If you are interested, open source can open a lot of avenues for you when it comes to things like public speaking. So you could be doing interviews and panels because of your experiences, or you could be like me, doing webinars like this one. Thank you, Tech Stories, for inviting me to talk to people about how to get started with open source and to get excited about open source and sort of advocate for it. And finally, and I think this is probably the coolest thing, and one of the things that we kind of all hope for, but you can get job opportunities through open source. In fact, all of the people I'm showing on the screen today do get paid to be a part of the open source world, and they get paid for their open source contributions. So I think that's a very big myth sometimes with the open source community, that like it's just all a thankless job, but it really isn't, and there is a lot of value that you can get. But now that we kind of have a sense of what it can do for you, I bet a lot of you are wondering, what is open source code again? And I want to talk a little bit about that. So legally, and I would say the most baseline definition of open source is the idea that it is code that anybody can use, modify, enhance, learn about, whatever they want to do with it. They have the ability to do so. And I say legally specifically because open source software, open source code will come with something called an open source license. You might have noticed on GitHub, various repos will have something like an MIT license or an Apache license. Those are all examples of open source licenses that actually enable the free and open software development that occurs. But I like to joke that essentially, if all that matters is that it's available for anybody to use, then my projects from university that I put on GitHub are also open source, right? Maybe, maybe not. And to be truthful, legally, maybe. But when we talk about open source code, we're not talking about my projects from university. We're talking about code that powers, according to a recent survey, I think like 97% of all commercial code. We're talking about code that like makes up 78% of all the code that is written around the world. We're talking about some really good quality, really pervasive, really flexible technology that has stood the test of time and has existed for multiple years. So what makes open source, outside of its legal definition, actually be able to do that, actually be able to go and cross so many boundaries and bring such a large community of engineers together? And I like to think that there are two things, and I'd like to give you that extended definition today that actually makes open source bigger than just its legal ability to extend intellectual property, right? The first one is open source code is extremely transparent, it's very well documented, and it has very, very good tests. You can imagine probably that if you have code that literally anybody can use and can modify, that things are going to get quite messy and chaotic very, very quickly. And that if there are requests and contributions coming in from all over the place, that things could get really brittle and things could break. But somehow open source has managed to withstand that and convinced a lot of people around the world that they should be using open source software over and above what a company might develop, right? And that is because of these characteristics of open source software, that it's very transparent. Every decision that is made with regards to that software is openly, publicly documented somewhere that anybody can access, so they can get all the context they need. And it's not just in one developer's head who you're chasing on a Saturday, like, where are you? And do you know how to do this? The other thing, and I think one of the most beautiful things about open source is that the code is actually community driven. We're going to talk a little bit about the logistics and the actual roles in the open source world, but at the end of the day, the code does belong to its user base, whoever the customers are, whoever is using that software for whatever reason, and they do get a much larger voice in influencing and determining the future of this repo, of the future of the software, and also just how long it will last. And so I think a lot of people you will meet that I have met, when I ask them, why did you get started with open source? What was your reasoning? It's not necessarily those reasons that you saw on my previous slide regarding how it actually helped their career. It's not necessarily about the job opportunities or the money that they're paid. Many people get into open source purely because they really enjoy the community and they want to nerd out with people who have the same interests and the same passions as them. But what does that mean in practice? So I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk you through, kind of give you a map of how you would navigate the open source world, because it sounds so great. You have a community, you have really nice code, apparently, and you get to be part of something so big and so much cooler. But what does that actually mean? Because like I said, allowing a number of contributions or just a number of people on the same area can be pretty chaotic. So in a lot of open source repositories, projects, and communities, you're going to see a couple different roles at play. You're going to see a couple different types of people, and they are all incredibly and equally important to keeping the thing working, essentially. So I want to first talk to you about open source governance, which is who are the people involved in open source, where do you fit in, and what do they do? And I want to start with our maintainers. You're going to hear this term quite often when you're talking to someone within the open source world. And these guys, they're basically your managers of the project. That doesn't mean they don't write code, but it also doesn't mean that they were the original authors or the owners of this repository or the software as a whole. But they are definitely the ones with the administrative rights to the software at the moment, which means they're merging your PRs. PRs are pull requests, so your code contributions. They're the ones merging those in. They are the ones who are moderating and facilitating discussions. They're also helping uphold the code of conduct to make sure that the space is welcoming and accepting to everyone that comes in there. And overall, they're just there being the glue for the project, making sure that everybody gets what they need, the questions are being answered, and the customers are being listened to and figuring out what they're going to do next. The other kind of people you're going to see in the open source world, which is where many of you will start, are your contributors. Literally anybody that has made an open source contribution to any project will be a contributor to that project. In fact, a lot of maintainers will start out as contributors. In fact, in the scenarios that I gave you earlier, one of our Intuit employees, Leo, mentioned how he had started out as a contributor to the Argo CD project and then eventually gained the trust and went up in the ranks. And now he's not just an employee in Intuit, but he's also a maintainer for that project. So there definitely is a pipeline between starting out as a contributor and becoming a maintainer, essentially getting more responsibility. We also talked about your authors. Those are your OGs, the people who originally came up with this idea, wrote maybe a portion of that code, but that does not necessarily mean that they're still active with the project. And so sometimes they might be maintainers, but other times they may have moved on to a new project and a different horizon. And finally, and like I said, all of these people are equally important to the health and longevity of a software, open source software project, is your community members. These are everybody that is actually using the software. And like I mentioned before, they are critical in influencing decisions and deciding what is the future of this project, what are we going to work on next, which bugs get priority when it comes to fixing them, and which feature requests get priority to get worked on first. So that's on the governance side, but you'll also notice that a lot of open source software has sort of a template, and many of them will share common elements. So I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about some of those elements within a project that you're going to see in any open source project. They might be named a little different. They might be in slightly different locations, but for the most part, they all serve the same purpose. And that can be a good place to orient yourself when you are looking at a new project, to be like, okay, let me find all of these items, and then I can continue and figure out what I want to do next. So the first one, and probably the most obvious one, is your README. It should be right front and center on your project, on any open source project that you go to. And it is typically an explanation of what it is and how to use it. And so the README is typically specifically for the community members. If you're looking to contribute to the project, you might not get all the information you need in the README because it's really not meant for people who are trying to add to it. It's meant for people who are actually trying to use it. Versus what you're going to find is some sort of contributing file in caps lock, mind you. So in many projects, you'll have either like a document folder or maybe on the root area somewhere, there's going to be a little contributing.md or contributing sort of file, and that will tell you exactly what you need on how to contribute to the project. Typically, this file will include things like how to run the project, style, formatting guides. Are they a spaces kind of project? Are they a tabs kind of project? Do they like nested ternaries? The answer is no, but they could like nested ternaries. And, all sorts of things about how do you get started? How do you pick an issue? What type of issues are available? All sorts of information that you would need to get started on contributing. The next thing you're going to have is some sort of code of conduct. Pretty standard stuff, but it doesn't hurt to know where it is and what it says, especially if there are certain things that are allowed or not allowed within that project. And then you have your license. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but you cannot have open source software without a license. A project can claim to be open source. They can, follow the values of open source, but legally, if they do not have an open source license, then they are not open source. And why does that matter to you? It matters to you because if you do things that the open source license traditionally allows you to do, like making the fork, making enhancements, making changes, you don't want to get in trouble or get sued because they just changed their mind. So having that license is very important. And also sometimes when you're participating in events like Hacktoberfest, Lucy mentioned earlier that in the month of October around the world, there is a celebration of open source. Many people who give out prizes during that time will often just have that as their only request or requirement that, oh, if you can make any contribution anywhere that you like, it just has to be an open source repo. And finally, you're going to have something called issues. I think most of you should be familiar with what this is, but in general, issues are used to track work, right? They are units of work. Sometimes they've already been triaged, so you already know what you're going to be working on, how you're going to do it. But most of the time, if that hasn't happened yet, it is the space to do that. It's the space to have discussions with the community, with the contributors, with the maintainers, all come together to look at this track of work, this unit of we need to do something and figure out how that would work and collaborate and work together. So keeping all of this in mind, now that I've given you a map, I think you can see where I'm going with this. Contributing to open source should feel as easy as find a project you are interested in, select the issue, the unit of work that you want to do, and then make a pull request. Simple, right? I guess I'm done with the presentation already. But in reality, I think many of you are going to find, and you are absolutely not alone. I feel like I've gone through all of these stages. You're going to find that so many people have fears around the pipeline and the process, and what looks like it should be really a straightforward issue just becomes not straightforward. You're worried about where to start. You're worried about what type of project to pick. You can't find a project, or you see a project, but then you're like, I do not understand this code. I cannot find the issues that I want, or I don't know which issues to pick up. And then there's also our good old friend, imposter syndrome, coming in the mix, just, to have fun and making you think, well, what if they don't like my code? What if I just make a complete fool of myself publicly forever on the internet? And I don't think anybody wants to go through those feelings. So today, in the next half of my presentation, what I really want to do with all of you is walk you through these exact 3 steps, our 1, 2, 3s of contributing, and share with you some tips and advice, including survey responses that I've collected about how you can reduce your fears and feel confident and excited about open source and doing all of the things. So let's begin with finding a project. Often people will ask, I don't know where to start. I don't know how to find a project. I don't know which project to pick. And I think the best advice that I and so many other maintainers can give you is just start with something that you know or use. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the biggest ones is that because open source tends to be so asynchronous, right? It's like your maintainers, your owners of the project, they could be in a completely different time zone from you. They could be speaking a completely different language than you. There are so many different domain knowledge and contextual information that you need. And while open source does a better job than most in documenting that and having those public artifacts and having that open communication, nobody is perfect. And just having some sort of knowledge about ahead of time of how this works or being a user yourself can be really helpful in reducing the stress of, will I be able to figure this out? In fact, in my survey, I found that a lot of the people I surveyed started with open source, or their first contribution tended to be because of this, because they were already using the software or they knew of the software and had to do some work. For example, Leo mentioned that the previous company that he worked at had requested that he make an integration in Argo. And, he could have taken a million ways out of that, could have found a workaround, could have just reported the issue or requested a feature to the community and then just waited in case it happens or doesn't. But he took that leap of faith and said, you know what, this is open source. How hard can that be? And jumped into the code base. And now fast forward, he is a maintainer for that repo. And so there are so many different ways in which you are probably interacting with open source software, even if you don't realize it. And it can be a great way to get started and in a low confidence way. I think that I read a blog post recently about another person who her first contribution was simply because she used Jupyter notebooks for school so often, and like one specific integration for it, and like really just wanted to help out because she thought of a feature that would just make her life a lot easier in school. And so when she found out that that integration for Jupyter Notebooks was open source, she just went and made the contribution and helped her and millions of others get this new feature. So definitely starting with things you know or use can be a great way. But another thing to consider is how active the project is. What does that mean? It means thinking about the actual activity, the amount of community engagement that is going on in the repos. Things like, how often are people committing to this repo? Are all the commits just like dependency updates, or are people actually fixing things, adding new things, and changes? Is it growing or does it seem stagnant? The other thing you want to look at the issues, the PRs, go into the forums, the discussion forums, and actually see, is there community engagement going on? Things like, first of all, are there any issues that have been tagged as good first issues, or whatever the project uses? Typically, they will say good first issue, but they may have something like beginner friendly, etc. So do they have things like that that would be good for beginners? Do they have discussions in the forums? Are people asking questions, and are the maintainers providing helpful feedback? Now, I want to start with a big disclaimer here. The activity of a project is great. It's wonderful, but that does not mean that it's not a good project if it's missing, if any of these things are not like super high. It does not mean that that project is bad in any way. But when you are a new contributor that is just starting out, it can be nice to pick projects. These are typically larger projects, more popular projects, but it helps to do that because they already have such a large community base. They have so many maintainers that you're more likely to get help. And if you can see that when people are asking questions, they're getting help quickly and things like that, it can be nice as a beginner to do that. And disclaimer part 2, when we talk about good first issues and being a beginner in open source, it does not necessarily mean that you are a beginner towards engineering or in software in general. It just means you are new to doing open source. You might not know the way open source works. You might not be familiar with that specific project. There is so much domain, so much contextual knowledge that you might be missing. So when someone labels a good first issue, it typically means that issue is just contained and you can kind of work on it without necessarily needing to touch like a million files and breaking 3 million tests. It's meant to make it easy for you to step foot into that project, to start learning about it and start contributing. Finally, though, I know I just gave you a lot of information, but I don't want you guys to overthink it. Honestly, just sticking with my first point, find something you're interested in. It might not be something you're actively using or might have not known about, but like as long as you feel interest in that area, as long as you feel some sort of incentive of, I really like this thing, I think it's really good, I want to help out, that is all you need to get started. And because we've been talking about the community, I want to share Farah's story of how she got started with open source. And it was because she was an intern at Red Hat. And Red Hat, if you might be familiar, does in fact own and work a lot in various open source spaces. And so that was how she got started. And for her, it wasn't about which project she picked and things. I mean, she was an intern, but it was more about the community and finding that engaging community that was able to help her and get her off her feet and do her first contribution. So sometimes that's why looking at the activity, like I said, can be kind of helpful because you want to feel welcomed and you want to feel supported, especially in your first contribution. All right. By the way, disclaimer, not a disclaimer, just a little plug. Lucy mentioned this as well, but if you go to opensourceintuit.com, you are going to see a lot of information about the projects that we have and the ones that we are currently supporting and helping out with. So if you are looking for projects to start on, it can be a good one. But let's move on to issues. So you found a project. You're vaguely or very interested in their premise, and now you want to figure out what work to do. How do you find those issues? The first thing is to locate the location of where the issues are. You need to go to the contributing guide. But once you do that, you can look for those good first issues, like I said. And to pick the issue, though, you want to confirm with the maintainers that it is actually up for grabs and that they are ready to receive PRs. Because many times people will report bugs, people will report feature requests, and there will be issues for all of that. And you might be interested in working on something, but the maintainers may have had other plans, or maybe somebody else already grabbed it and they didn't write that down in the issue because they discussed it elsewhere. There's just so many things. And instead of doing all the work and then realizing that they did not, in fact, want you to do that, it is best if you just ask before and make sure that you can actually take it. You don't have to always go for the popular issues. You just really need to communicate that, hey, I am interested in this. Can I start? And the minute they say, yeah, go ahead, I'm excited to see your contribution, you can get started. In fact, in my survey, I was asking the maintainers, what do you look for when you're, when you're looking at PRs, when you're reviewing them, and when you're trying to figure out, what is a good contribution? Like, what is a good contribution in your mind? And one of the things that the maintainer said was, I really want to make sure that the PR is actually addressing something that we care about, that the community wants to happen first. The other thing that I want you guys to remember is that you should be totally free and fine to ask for help and ask questions. And I have seen a lot of people feel shy of saying, well, I don't know, is this a dumb question? Should I have been able to just understand everything because it was written down in an issue? And while there might be some of that in the community, there might be an expectation that the description, whatever they use to explain the unit of work and the documentation and the source code are adequate. Don't believe that. And feel free to ask questions. Make sure that you fully understand what you're getting into. This repo is new to you. No one is judging your software engineering skills. No one is saying, oh my God, I can't believe you asked that question. You must not be skilled. Nobody's saying that. You are saying that to yourself, but nobody is saying that to you, I promise. And so it's really, really important to feel confident. If you're interested in solving something, just go for it. Just make sure you communicate and you ask questions. But for all of the people who are saying, what if I don't know how to code in that stack or just code in general? I want to tell you, not all contributions have to be code. In fact, a lot of contributions are not code, and they are extremely helpful to the community. In fact, there's a lot of ways in which you could be contributing that is not code. For example, you could be updating or improving documentation. Let's say you use their software and you found their docs are not very useful in figuring out some of the things. Let me add a troubleshooting guide. Or you're translating their documentation. You're bilingual or you speak anything other than English. And you're like, hey, you have the English stuff, but let me add a translation so that other speakers of this community can also be a part of this software and this journey. Or you are writing a blog or just a tutorial about how to use their software, just helping them stay alive, engaging their community. You're creating tutorials. Maybe you found a bug, so you report that bug, or you have a feature request. There are basically a gazillion non-code ways, all of which contribute to that activity that we just talked about on the project side, all of which contribute to that and help the community grow and help the software get better. In fact, I'd like to tell you a fun story of my friend Luciana. Her first project was a README update because she really wanted to refresh the docs. She was like, I want to upload some nice GIFs. I'm all for that, by the way. And just make it so that people can find the docs better and just, have more images, more screenshots, because that is always easier than just a giant amount of text. And the funny thing is, she was so excited that she got this code merged and everything was great, but she broke the software. Like she merged it, and then 2 minutes later, the maintainers were like, "Oop, you broke it." And and I think it's just funny because you're like, how did I do that? And I'll let you guys guess in the questions how she broke that. But if you are really curious, I will tell you at the end of the presentation. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, but also don't think that your first contribution has to be a really fancy feature. It can genuinely be a README update. In fact, one of my first contributions was me alphabetizing a list because I was struggling so much to find things, and that list was one of those really long ones. And so I was like, can I just alphabetize this for you guys so that you have a system? And that was my first contribution. All right, moving on to our final step. So you have found the issue you're interested in, you message the maintainers, they said you can go for it, and it's time to make a pull request. Now, in case you're not familiar, your traditional model, I guess, in open source is going to be you fork the code and then you clone and make the code contributions on your own branch. For any of you who are not familiar with forking, it simply is the act of making a clone or I guess a copy of whatever the main version of that software is. So there's going to be a main version, you make a fork. Now that is your copy. Nobody else is that copy does not get used by other people. So when people are using the software, they're using the default one, not yours, which means you have full freedom to go crazy and have fun and do whatever it is that you want. And most of the time, you're going to be working on one of the issues and making the fix or adding the feature. And then when you're feeling good about that, you can send it back and ask the maintainers to then pull those changes, which is why it's a pull request, into that main default copy of the code. But some things that I think a lot of us struggle with is the fear of not having your contribution accepted. There's always this, well, what if my PR gets rejected? What if my PR doesn't get reviewed? What ifs? And I want to share with you some things that you can do to kind of help with that and just set yourself up for the best review of your life. And the first thing is just make sure you're following the contribution and style guides to the best of your ability. So when I surveyed all the different members of the open source community and also in my own conversations with people, I asked them what they look for in PRs, and almost all of them, and I am not joking, almost all of them said something to the tune of, I make sure they are following my project's contribution guidelines. And the other thing that many of them said was, I also like to make sure that they are doing other things other than just fixing the problem or writing the feature request. For example, if it was a bug that you're fixing, did you add new tests to make sure that that bug is now covered in the testing? Or if you created a new feature or modified a feature, did you also modify the documentation so that people know that this is going to change? And just in general, looking at things around the fix, did you use variables that are semantic and make sense? Did you use helper functions? Whatever their style guides are, thinking about all of those things will set you up for success. That being said, so many times you're going to feel like you're writing code that you're not sure about. Maybe you picked up an issue and the maintainers gave you a method that they were thinking of, that they're like, hey, I think you should do it like this. And when you actually write that code, you're not feeling good about it, or you're like, well, this is just not my best work because I feel like there's a better way to do this, but I just don't know enough about this code to write it better. That is absolutely fine. That's going to happen millions of times to all of us. And the best thing you can do at that point is just surface to the maintainers what it is that you're unsure about. For example, you could add your own review comments and say, hey, I know I did it like this in this line of code, but I'm thinking maybe there's a better way. Can you guide me, direct me in terms of like what could be a better way to write this? Or, hi, I wrote this way because I think that's what you meant, but do you think this other way would be better? Things like that. If you have bugs or fixes or problems, just like running your code and you're like, I just could not get it to work, include context with your questions, include information like, hey, so when I followed guidelines, insert guidelines, and tried to insert the action that you took, I got unexpected outcome instead of expected outcome. Can you help me understand what I might have done wrong? Things like that, instead of just saying, hey, it's not working, so ... because that's not helpful for anybody. So thinking about those things and just kind of seeing how much more can you communicate, it really just comes down to that. How much more can you communicate in your comments, in your conversations, in your discussions ahead of time will save you the back and forth and potentially having your PR rejected because they just don't need that feature anymore, or they found a different way to solve it and things like that. Speaking of PRs getting rejected, I think it's really important that you all remember not to take that personally. I think that PRs probably will get rejected. I can't guarantee that just following the guidelines and being honest about things you're not sure of will ensure that your PRs are always accepted, that you write the best code of your life, right? There are going to be times for multiple reasons that a maintainer might say, sorry, but like we cannot accept this at the moment, or we cannot accept this at all. And I want you guys to remember when that happens and the little voice in your brain thinks, oh my God, I suck. I'm just gonna quit my job now, open a cat cafe, maybe. I don't know. Don't let that voice overtake what you have done and the work you have done. It's still valuable. It's still great. You have taken a lot of courage to get to step 3 of 3 in the open source pipeline. And at that moment, you just take the learning, you ask them for the clarification, you take whatever learnings they have for you, and you move on and you keep going. But do not let yourself get discouraged. Speaking of getting discouraged, the final advice I can give you is to be as patient as possible. And the reasoning is, while the maintainers that I gave you some examples of earlier all get to do open source, as their day job, it's more likely that you are going to have maintainers who have double lives, who have other jobs during the day, and they're also maintainers. But also, you're just going to have maintainers who are chock full of things to do because there are just that many PRs. Because one of the upsides of working on a big project, a popular project, is the support, but the biggest downside is everybody has the same idea as you. And so most of the time, those maintainers are way more overwhelmed than would be usual. And so giving yourself that grace and patience is important. That does not mean you allow yourself to get ghosted, but it does mean that compared to school or work, where we do get a much faster development cycle, you've got to give your maintainers a little bit of grace, but feel free to contact them. Most of the time, their contributing guides will have some sort of agreement or understanding of, hey, this is how long we're going to take to review your stuff. And like I shared it earlier, sometimes maintainers will work on reviewing the PRs that are for highly requested features or very, very broken, very, very critical bugs before yours. And so if you're not working on either of those, that doesn't mean your contribution is invaluable. It just means you have to be a little patient. All right, so hopefully, after all of this information, I've got one thing to say to you, and that is, you got this, okay? There's been so much information thrown at you today. I would be a little overwhelmed if I were you, but I hope I did my best to distill it down. And just remember, you guys are all great. You guys are all open source superstars. And instead of sad Taylor's version, which is what we had earlier, I hope you're all feeling closer to my happy Taylor's version slide, because I know you guys are going to have some really fun, really exciting PRs accepted, even if your original contributions are small. But you guys all bring a lot of value to the community. Just being here at this talk today, you're bringing value to the open source community because you're here and you're listening. And you might make mistakes, but that is okay. We are all for learning. We're going to keep our heads up and we're going to keep going. So that is everything I have for you today. I have a good amount of time for questions. So I'm very excited. I'm going to pass it back to Lucy.